everyone, welcome to the first lecture in our last unit. You're almost there. I know you were tired. I know you're probably overwhelmed. I know you're very ready for this social distancing and distance learning experiment to be over. I am right there with you. But we are going to get it done. We're going to make it happen. And we are going to put this behind us. But let's go ahead and get into it. All right. So my face is in the way. I'm going to be really glad when I don't have to keep moving my face. One of many things that I'm sure we are all going to be happy about. I'm going to start here. This is not the content for this unit, but this is the first thing I ask you to do. And that is to watch this movie 13 by Ava DuVernay. Hopefully you've already started it or you finished it from this point. For many of you, the first part of it, you're going to be like, Ms. Dietrich, I feel like we just learned all these things. But the point of this film is to really kind of bridge the gap between the things that we've been talking about all year and that you know are very important to who we are as a country right now and what I think is really important about our history. And bridge that with the last couple presidents and this last era that we're going to talk about before our time is done. And this film is really making an argument that even though we supposedly ended slavery in the United States, that something of that nature is still happening in the United States. And so it's kind of talking about that. And so I kind of want to walk you through a couple of things that will either help make the documentary more clear or will help as you're getting there. Okay. All right. Number one, if we think about how we divide American history, from 1619, although we might argue it's a couple years prior to that, to 1865, we have slavery in the United States. That is an institution within the United States. That supposedly ends in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, which says this right here. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So essentially, we've ended slavery except for the punishment of a crime. And so from then, from the end of slavery, we have segregation, whether that's Jim Crow or whether that's some other version of it. And what we see in that period is that we get what's known as slavery by another name. And I'm covering up the cover of the book that kind of goes through a lot of this research. But essentially what we see when we no longer have the ability to enslave people in the United States, we criminalize their behavior so that we can use them as labor, since the 13th Amendment gives us that exception to Indian slavery. So we start to say that you can't have vagrancy, which is just kind of standing around, or loitering, or using marijuana, or other sort of behaviors that they start to criminalize. And this gives private industries and states a free labor source. They can say they've ended slavery, but they still have access to this labor. Okay? This time, or this timeline, that's the word I was looking for up here, ends that in 1964 because that's the Civil Rights Act. I would argue that that's not a perfect time frame, given that we know it takes a long time for things to adjust. And we can talk about issues in 2010 as well. 2020. Clearly, Ms. Dietrich is very tired already. Okay? But this film is really going to talk about that period afterwards. And they're going to argue that this is mass incarceration, or we do have mass incarceration, but they're going to argue that that's the new form of enslavement, that locking all of these people up is essentially that loophole. And so every generation or however we want to periodize time, will have that sort of a loophole that will allow us to continue to enslave people or exploit their labor source. Okay? So this film is going to talk about that primarily with Black and Brown people, but there also is going to be a part about immigration. I would challenge you to think about how we're also exploiting labor right now and kind of what that means when we're in the middle of a pandemic. How are we exploiting labor sources? And maybe what's going on in prisons at this time, because there are some funky things going on. They are some of our hottest spots for coronavirus right now because people are obviously very closely near each other in prison or in immigration detention centers right now. All right. If you're interested in this, a couple other things I want to point you out. Kanye West has a song called New Slaves, which he kind of talks about this. I can't handle the new Kanye, so we're not watching new Kanye. If you want to do that, though, this is old Kanye. You're more than welcome to think about that. The other thing is Jay-Z did this little thing called The War on Drugs is an Epic Failure, which is essentially how the film is going to talk about mass incarceration in connection to the war on drugs. It's short, it's animated, and it's Jay-Z, so you might check that out. He's really talking about marijuana laws in California. It's kind of what his argument is in that, but he makes some connection to New York and other places, and the kind of this discrepancy between how we police communities. All right. The other thing, it doesn't fit nicely into the context, so I'll just talk about it right now. One of the things as we move away from the civil rights movement is we actually see what's known as a prisoner's rights movement. So if you think back to our last unit, we talked about that many of the people that were involved in the civil rights movements end up being incarcerated or kind of going through the justice system because they broke the laws as they were fighting against discrimination and segregation and things of that nature. And there's also a conscious raising, so people are thinking about human rights or thinking about how they are treated. And so at Attica, which is in New York, there is an incident where they feel like their human rights are being violated, they're not being treated adequately, they don't have enough food, resources, things like that. And there's an incident that happens, and one of the parts of the prison essentially ends up in a riot, something to do with the gates, and the prisoners are released. And what they do is they essentially take that part of the prison over. In that process, they're going to hold some of the guards hostage for a decent amount of time. One guard will end up dying in that, and that he's injured, and they can't get him help fast enough. They can't get him out fast enough. But essentially, the prisoners are going to hold out. They're trying to negotiate, and this is a political negotiation for them. They're pretty dang educated. They know what they're doing. They know which politicians they need to contact, what journalists, what activists they need to contact to try and work on these negotiations. So there are people that are called to Attica to kind of help negotiate these things, and they're working through it. They're coming to a solution at the same time that they're trying to create order on the yard. And you can see the chaos afterwards, but on this picture. And they're trying to really treat the hostages respectfully, but they realize that the hostages are a bargaining chip. But essentially, they're on the verge to getting this figured out. And the governor of New York, Governor Rockefeller, he's thinking about running for president of the United States in 1972. And so he's trying to make a name for himself. So he's going to try and out law and order Nixon. So essentially be even tougher on crime, even tougher on, I would argue, Black and brown people than Nixon. And he makes a decision that rather than deal with this peacefully, he's going to send in law enforcement to end this uprising. And what they do is they essentially fire on the yard. And they are not careful when they fire. So they not only kill prisoners, they also kill guards. And then they blame the prisoners, they blame the inmates for the death of the guards. And they spread terrible, terrible lies about the prisoners like slit people's throats and things like that. And none of those things happen. And so it's this really cruel, unfortunate, unnecessary event of violence. And that's covered up by the state of New York. So there's actually very little that's written about Attica. This book came out a couple years ago, if you're interested in it. And the woman, Heather Ann Thompson, who worked on it, she had to go to great lengths to write this book and to try and track down these documents. And she actually names names. She names the people that committed acts of violence. And then when people tried to go back to look at her documents, and that should be in the state of New York, they have since disappeared. So this is really not a story that people want out, but it's an important kind of bridge to a film that I've asked you to watch, as well as our last unit. Attica is also called a movie, and there's some other things out there, so if you're interested, you might check that out. Whoop, clicking buttons. Good job, Miss Cedric. Okay, try this again. All right, another thing that doesn't fit quite well with the other stuff is the 1970s, which is where we're essentially heading, is a time of cults and serial killers. Lots of fun things. So I think it was maybe, I don't know, last year, the year before, where we kind of went on a serial killer binge, a lot of Ted Bundy things out there. So we know that under the baby boom, that the pure number of crimes are going to increase just because there's an increase in the number of kids, essentially, or young adults in the country. So statistically, we are going to see a rise, but more of it is a pure number just because there are more young people. And I'm not saying like all young people commit crimes, just like if there's a sheer larger number of them, you're more likely to have crime happen. So there's some pretty famous serial killers. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I have a feeling this is some of your jam, so you might look at some of these guys. This guy will look familiar to you. He is the guy that they found just north of us in Sacramento just a couple years ago and arrested. So some of these guys are still alive. The other thing I'll point out about these guys, we don't have nearly as many serial killers now. And that's because we now have DNA evidence and things like that that we didn't have as well at this moment in time, and that law enforcement talks to each other. And so if you commit a crime in California and then you run to Nevada and commit a crime, they're more likely to talk to each other. But this is a time where we don't have all of that. So they're able to get away with those things. All right, the other thing we have is the era of cults. It's a weird time in American history. And cults are essentially a group of people that are kind of loyal to a single figure or a single idea, in not a very logical way. They're very deep into something. This is kind of like religion on steroids, this belief in something. Last unit, we talked about Charles Manson. Sorry to the singer. It's Charles Manson. And he's kind of the person that we think of. And so he's running a cult. Another one that's really famous is the Jonestown Massacre. And Jones is running what many people consider a cult. And he's really paranoid about sort of the FBI and people messing with his cult or his group. And so he moves all of his people to a country in Latin America. And he's kind of worried about the oversight or the questions that the government and people are asking about his cult. So he actually convinces his followers to commit mass suicide. They all drink Kool-Aid that is laced with cyanide, if I remember, and they die. So you're talking about 910 people die in this mass suicide. Ooh, things are very hard today. And then right before that, they'd also shot a congressman as he was fleeing to his plane. So good times. So also when you say drink the Kool-Aid, that's where that comes from. All right, moving on from serial killers. All right, this is one, I think, your second journal question for this unit. But I want you to think about it as we start talking about the presidents. There'll be more of a heavy focus on the presidents this unit as I kind of try and bridge from Nixon to as current as I can get you. And there are a lot of controversies about abuses of power. And so I want you to really think about, like, what does it mean to live in a democracy? What is sort of the relationship between the citizens and the government and the president? And like, where do people's loyalty lies? What are you supposed to do in a democracy? And what I really want you to think about is, how do we as citizens keep our power? How do we kind of hold those in power accountable? And what do we do when that starts to fall apart? What role do we as citizens have? Can we protest? Can we boycott? Can we vote? Can we do some other things? Right? And where should our loyalties lie? And I would argue that our loyalties are to our country and to the Constitution, or the ideas of the Constitution, even if it is not a perfect document, rather than a party or a person or a figure. And so what do we do when our system starts to get out of whack? And then just for fun, it's on here from when I did this as an energizer. I want you to just think about, what movement would you have joined from the last unit? Okay, where you fall in these, or maybe how many of these would you join? And just for fun, maybe think about which ones do you think I would join and which ones would I stay away from. I'll tell you the answer. I'm not going to be part of the establishment. I don't like to listen to those in power too much. And the other one is counterculture. Not because that doesn't sound like fun, but I like to be in control, even though I don't want to listen to other people who are in control. And that is too much outside my control, too much fun for Miss Teacher. But maybe think about it for yourself. All right. I think I actually talked about this in our very first lecture this term, but just in case, these are kind of the guys that we're going to talk about this last unit, and there's more of them than we've seen so far, so maybe just kind of make sure you have them down. We're actually going to start with Nixon. We've just already talked about Nixon, so he's not on this slide, just don't forget about Mr. Nixon. I promise you, he won't let you forget about him. So we're going to go from Ford, very short time with Ford, then Carter, Democrats, and then 12 years with Republicans. And then we'll get Mr. Bill Clinton, Baby Bush, or Bush Jr., Obama, and then Trump. Okay? And then this amendment up here, I think we already talked about, so I'm just going to skip it for right now. All right. Also, these questions we've seen a whole bunch of times, but really, I would say keep these in the back of your mind, or maybe start thinking about what we've learned this term, because I think that these are going to come back to you. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, as we wrap up this term. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, probably in an assessment form. So think about that. I'll get back to you when I finalize what your assessment's going to be. But really think about what change have we seen when it comes to opportunity in the United States, to what it means to be free, who gets to be a citizen, and what sort of rights you have as a citizen as we go through that. And then I really want you to think about that as we go through this unit, because we're going to see a backlash to a lot of the change that we've seen prior. All right. This is also for fun. I'm not going to play you any music this unit, but this is kind of the 70s music, so which is where we're starting. So if that's your jam, there you go. If you're like, I've heard that name, but I don't know who that person is or that group is, maybe take some time. We have some time on our hands right now. Maybe listen to something new. All right, but we're going to dig into it. So sometimes I would call this unit Nixon and beyond, or this now it says Nixon and current, or the Southern strategy and beyond. But essentially, we're going to go from Nixon, or the backlash to the civil rights movements, to as current as we can get us. I'm going to try really hard to finish Nixon through Carter in this one, do Reagan and Bush Sr. in the next one, then maybe do Clinton and Bush Jr., and then one final wrap up. So I don't even know what I just said, but I think I'm going to try and do it all in 3 or 4 lectures and get it done as fast as possible, so you have a little bit more time to wrap things up and finish the term out. But let's get into Mr. Nixon. All right, so this is the 1968 election. We've talked about this before, but I just want to point it out again because Nixon's going to come in and say that he has a lot of authority. He's got the support of the American people. But if we look at this, it's actually not as drastically in favor of Nixon's favor, or not as much in Nixon's favor as he would like to think. So if we look at the popular vote, it's actually not, it's actually pretty close. So Nixon's 31.7, we'll say, and Humphrey is 31 point, we'll round it to 3 or whatever. So not that far apart. But we get the third party guy in here, and ultimately Nixon will win more of the electoral votes. But he's going to say essentially that this gives him a lot of support. And if we remember back to, actually I didn't talk about it last unit. Can you tell Miss Teacher was really freaking tired today? Okay, so we talked about Nixon first unit this time together because he was Eisenhower's VP. And then he's going to lose against Kennedy, and he's going to be kind of a sore loser. He's going to try and run for governor of California. He loses that too, and he kind of yells at media. It's like, it's your fault. You won't have me to kick around anymore. I'm done playing with you guys. We've never, ever heard another president yell about media ever again, right? So when Nixon decides he wants to run in 1968, he's going to enlist some friends. And he's going to enlist this guy in his young form and this guy is in his old form, Roger Ailes, to essentially use media to his favor. Roger Ailes is very famous because Roger Ailes will go on to find Fox News. And it is Nixon that essentially helps massage the legislative process to make commercial news possible. So Nixon is the gift that keeps on giving in my mind, because he is going to use media at this moment to win, and then he ultimately will make it possible to have the Fox Newses and the CNNs of the world. Okay, but he's going to win, and he's going to claim that he has support of the silent majority and that he's here to bring law and order back. All right, so this is the part that I just talked about. I'm going to keep going. Speaking of very tired, I did not drastically change my slides from what I would have done in class. So normally I would do these notes with you rather than having you just do it from the book. So you're welcome, or I'm sorry, however you want to look for it. I'm not going to read everything, but I'm going to kind of go through these. If you want to pause it or go on my lecture and write them down that way, you're more than welcome to do that. But I'm going to kind of hit the major things. All right. So Nixon's going to come in, and he is going to be more conservative. And what that means is a smaller, less active government. He's going to argue that essentially that the federal government had gotten too big. Lots of presidents come in and say that this is what's going on, that the government has gotten too big and they're going to fix it. Guess what? They don't do that. The only person that maybe made it smaller is the current president, and we'll talk about that later. But he's going to come in and say, essentially, government has done too many things, we got to shrink it. And he's going to come up with some new ideas. He's going to come up with this idea called new federalism. Okay? So this is a relationship between the national government and the state governments. So remember in the last unit, there was kind of a battle between the national government and the state governments. The state governments weren't protecting people's rights. They weren't enforcing civil rights. And so the national governments essentially had to come in and say, come on, guys, do the right thing. Okay, so we see this battle. Under Nixon, we're going to see that change. So essentially, under this and what's known as revenue sharing, the federal government's going to collect all that tax money. Okay? And then they're going to distribute it back to the states. And the reason Nixon says that they should give it back to the states is that smaller government or state governments have a better idea of how to spend that tax money. Okay? So the states know better. There's some problems with this. If we know that this is an era where the states are withholding benefits or withholding rights, this gives them the power to do that. And so he's essentially giving more power back to the states. And remember, we've talked about this a lot of times. It's states' rights for what? To discriminate, to segregate. And he's helping that process along. We haven't seen very much support for this idea until really the current administration. I will argue that, or I won't argue, but I will point out that there's a disagreement right now about sort of federal money or how states contribute to federal money. So, for example, you might have heard something about like not bailing out Democratic states and the Senate not wanting to give a lot of aid to certain states like New York or California. And New York kind of piping back and saying, like, essentially, we give far more to the federal government than we take out. So still some arguments about the relationship between states and the federal government. It's a complicated thing, but how much the states contribute or how much the federal government gives to the states is still something that is very complicated and political. All right. So the other thing is Nixon's going to come up with this idea called the Southern Strategy. Nixon is a brilliant politician. I would argue an evil genius when it comes to these things, but he pretty much knows what he's doing. So the Southern Strategy is essentially to appeal to former segregationists, okay, so in the South, so what are known as Dixiecrats. So he wants them to switch from being Democrats, but segregationists, and switch to the Republican Party. He's essentially looking for a way to strengthen the Republican Party and to grow the Republican Party. And I mentioned kind of his evil geniusness because there are parts of his career where he is more supportive of African Americans, but he sees a political opportunity and he's going to take it and he's going to run with it. Okay? So this Southern Strategy is going to weaken some of the successes that we saw in the last unit. It's going to weaken the Voting Rights Act. So again, you want to prevent African Americans from voting because you're trying to grow the Republican Party and you're trying to appeal to segregationists. Right? So it's going to do lots of things to try and slow down integration in the South, to oppose busing that was desegregating schools, and supporting local government control or states' rights. Okay? He's very successful at this. We'll kind of see this in the electoral maps as we go through this unit. We also see his success in that in the current voting patterns that we see today. If we think about that, the Dixiecrats are that deep South region, that region that was the Confederacy that had been blue prior to this. He's now turning it red in a way that we still see on an electoral map today. That's going to kind of bleed into how he looks at crime or the Supreme Court at this time. Right? So he's going to name some conservative judges to the Supreme Court. And this is his way of starting his war on crime and essentially going after those people that are breaking laws or hurting law and order. Please remember that this is the end of the civil rights movement, where a lot of people have done civil disobedience and broken laws that they viewed as unjust. But this is him appealing to that other side and say, essentially, we're going to crack down on anybody who is breaking the law, whether that law is moral or not. Okay. He does do a couple moral, liberal things, increasing funding for food stamps and increasing payments to Social Security. All right, just to kind of show you the completeness of his, I'm going to argue, cruelty. You can see this in this quote, and you also see it when you watch the movie. So this is his advisor who recently said, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt their communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So if we're thinking about a way to criminalize people, a way to criminalize or quiet anybody who is dissenting or criticizing your presidency or your administration, he's gonna make you go away, essentially, or try to. All right. I've mentioned a couple times that he's kind of a political genius. He does not care about the environment, but he recognizes that that's kind of the way that the world is going, that is the way that the country is going. So he's going to support some things because he knows politically that will help him. I'm going to skip Rachel Carson for right now. But two of the things we see under Nixon is the Clean Air Act, so regulating pollution, right? And the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is supposed to carry out environmental laws and policies, essentially regulation to keep us safe, to keep our air safe, to keep our water safe, to keep us healthy, in contrast to what massive corporations and things like that are producing. A lot of successes, a lot of issues with this as well. In the most current administration, we've seen a lot of rollback of this regulation on safety for our water, for our air, all sorts of pollution. The Secretary of EPA for the first part of Trump's administration, actually in his role prior to this, had very close ties to oil and gas companies. Not good with the EPA, and he actually sued the EPA to limit their power lots and lots of times. So essentially, one of the things that we see in this administration is to put people in a position to oversee something that they want to undo. Scott Pruitt didn't believe in the EPA, didn't believe in the mission of the EPA. So you put him as the secretary of the EPA to dismantle what that organization is doing. This is also something that we've seen a lot in the news lately, essentially dismantling it even more while we're in this crisis because we're worried about the economy. So, we need to make it easier for companies to make money. And so we're going to roll back their environmental regulations because their profits are more important than safe air, water, etc. But who has some secret? All right. Some of the other things that we see with Nixon is something called OSHA. It is the Occupational Health and Safety Administration. It's not a very exciting thing, but it's important. So it's thinking about or trying to prevent workplace illness or injury. So any of you who have been working lately or have ever had a job, you had to do training about this is how you pick up a box. This is how you wash your hands. This comes from OSHA. I'm trying to keep people safe and essentially put some regulation to protect workers. It's not like we would be trying to protect workers or anything right now. These things will never come back, do they? All right, and then even though he's talking about the Southern strategy, he does take some steps to advance affirmative action, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this unit. Essentially, he's playing the field. He's trying to figure out how far can he push some things and maintain political power. All right, on foreign policy. Okay. On foreign policy, I'm going to try and abbreviate some of this stuff. This is his right-hand man, okay, Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is going to change things up. In other presidents or under other presidents, they'd had policies like containment. Kissinger is going to come up with this thing called realpolitik. Essentially, let's be realistic. Our policy should not be the same for worldwide. Okay, so the way that we interact with Vietnam is different than the way that we interact with Canada or Mexico. And let's make decisions based off of what is in our national interest and our relationship with that country rather than some blanket policy. So this is going to be a pretty big difference. We're also going to see something called detente, so trying to roll back the Cold War tension that we saw in the first half of the Cold War. So we get some deals as they're trying to ramp down the arms race or kind of prevent building of even more weapons. And then we're going to see that he is going to improve our relationship with China. So if you remember way back to our first unit, we are not recognizing the government of China. We're not recognizing Mao's government. We're recognizing the government in Taiwan. But he is going to start breaking that up. And so that the U.S. in a couple of presidents will finish the process of officially recognizing the government of China. And he's going to essentially use Kissinger to make some backdoor deals so that he will actually go and visit China and start a relationship with Mao. He's doing that because he's actually trying to mess with the relationship between China and the Soviet Union. So he's trying to create tension or take advantage of tension between those superpowers to the United States' benefit, as well as get the Soviet Union to work with the United States. Okay, however, there's also a lot of drama or tension going on in the Middle East. Okay, so I talked about this in the first unit, but there's continuous fighting essentially between Israel and their Arab neighbors. Soviet Union is often threatening to get involved in that. And so this is going to be a crisis, about to turn into a super conflict, or is threatening to turn into a super conflict. And again, essentially, Israel versus its Arab neighbors, Egypt and Syria. And so what we see, because the U.S. is willing to support Israel. I can help you. Thanks, Siri. Okay, so since we're willing to help Israel, the oil-producing countries that are known as OPEC are going to, OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, essentially an international cartel, if you want to think of it like that. Essentially, they're going to say, okay, United States, you can't access any of our oil. We are so angry with you, we are not going to ship any of our oil to you. Okay? That is a problem because we rely on their oil. It's a third of the oil that we were using at that moment. So this is going to create energy or contribute to an energy crisis in the United States because it's crazy. But oil is used in a whole bunch of things in our day-to-day life. So gas prices are going to go way up, okay, as the supply goes down. So this is a picture of sort of the chaos of that moment. Okay. The other thing is essentially prices on everything are going to go up because you need oil and gas to operate factories. You use it to make plastics. Farmers use it to produce crops and then also to transport crops. Sort of the transporting of all of our things are going to get more expensive. So this is going to create something that's called inflation, which is essentially prices increasing, but our purchasing power or our buying power doesn't change. Okay? And I think that will come back on the next slide. But before I forget, this picture right here, they start to have to ration gas. Right? And so you would get told what days you could go get gas based off of like your license plate. So if your license plate ends in an odd number, you could go on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. But you'd still have to wait in line, and they'd limit the amount of gas that you could get. So it's a chaotic thing. I think it looks like a Costco gas line. I don't know about you, but that's what it looks like. All right. Sorry, guys. Okay, so we'll come back to the oil stuff in just a second. This is just some reminders of some other things that are going on at the same time. Number one, Kissinger is trying to end the chaos in the Middle East. And so he's going to do what's known as shuttle diplomacy. He's essentially going to go back and forth between Egypt and Israel and Syria. And he's going to run to one and say, okay, this is the deal, or this is what the other side is saying. And then he's going to run back to the other one and say, okay, this is what they're saying. I mean, ultimately, he is going to get a deal one between Egypt and Israel, and one between Israel and Syria, so that there's some level of peace. So we're ending the military crisis and the oil embargo, and we're not going to World War III over this. But the other thing that is going on is we put a man on the moon. So at the same time this is happening, we're putting a man on the moon. That's a really big deal. The other reason I want to point this out, if you haven't seen Hidden Figures, you need to do that. Okay. But the other thing is, this was JFK's promise. Okay. He makes this in the early 1960s, saying we're going to put a man on the moon. And then it is Nixon, his opponent, when he's making those claims, that was going to actually be there when it happens. Nixon's going to take over in January of 1969. And they get a man on the moon in July. So 6 months later. You can't put a man on the moon in 6 months. It took all of that research, all of that time prior to make that happen. But Nixon's essentially going to claim that that is his success, that he's responsible for putting a man on the moon, when he's essentially just inheriting the success of that. But it's a huge moment for people to watch that on TV. This is where you hear that famous quote, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. There are 3 men that are on board. 2 of them get to walk, Armstrong and Aldrin, but Michael Collins has to stay on board, which I always think he drew the short stick that day. He gets so close to being one of the first people to walk on the moon. Instead, he just has to look at it from the window. A conspiracy theorist, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced in any conspiracies. There definitely was a man on the moon. If you think otherwise, you're a weirdo. It's fine. You're allowed to think your crazy things. But for the sake of my class, if for some reason you have to answer a test question about it, or an assessment question about it, there was a moon landing. There was no conspiracy. Just wanted to get that clear. All right. So this is the part. I don't know why these are out of order. Sorry, guys. Just to kind of end the inflation stuff and the things that are going on. So inflation is an overall increase in prices. It at this moment is an unacceptable level of 5%. Okay, so that's not a good level. Right? So even though Nixon typically believes in limited government, essentially the federal government staying out of things, he's going to decide he has to do something. So he's going to do a 90-day price freeze. Okay, nobody can increase their prices or their wages, and he's going to do this through an executive order. This will momentarily work, but it's going to come back again in 73 and 74 after he leaves our office, and it will be even sharper than the first time around. So I want you to think, could the president freeze prices today? Could the president order the entire nation to do something? And I don't think so. We definitely had some conversations about the president's power in the last couple of months. But we've seen is that the governors have more power right now than the president of the United States when it comes to a nationwide thing. But it's worked at this moment in time. All right. But then Nixon gets himself in some trouble in what is known as Watergate. If you want to, there's this really cool song by Gil Scott-Heron that's called the H2O Blues. So the Watergate Blues, essentially. And I'm not going to play it for you. It's about 8 minutes long. It's really good. But I'm just going to show you these couple of lines. And he says, how much more evidence do the citizens need that the election was sabotaged by trickery and greed? And this is so, and who we got didn't win. Let's do the whole goddamn election over again. That cesspool. All right, let's find out what he's talking about. All right, so this is the actual electoral map from 1972. It is actually not the most lopsided election. We will get one more in the 1980s that is even more lopsided than this by a single electoral vote. But essentially, Nixon wins in a landslide. He only loses Massachusetts and D.C., which is an incredible thing because one of the things that starts coming out right before this is the details of Watergate. And so what we need to ask ourselves in this scandal is, what did the president know and when did he know it? And this little cartoon is going to help us think about that. So here you have Nixon, and he's trying to use sandbags to stop this wave of evidence. And we know logistically there's nothing he's going to be able to do to stop this wave of evidence. And I feel like there are some similarities to what is going on in our lives right now. Well, let's see what happens to Mr. Nixon. Oh, second at this game today. All right. So this is just a funny thing. Early in Trump's office or time in office, he is going to be compared to Nixon. Actually, he's still compared to Nixon quite a bit right now. But the people are going to call him Nixonian, or that he was acting like Nixon in Nixon's Watergate scandal. And the Nixon Library actually responded and did not like this comparison and said, fun fact, President Nixon never fired the director of the FBI, which is what Trump had done when he fired Comey in 2017. And so they don't like this comparison to what's happening with the president. But Nixon did not fire the head of the FBI, just the special prosecutor, which we're going to get into. Trump now does not just fire the FBI head. He also fires anybody who testifies against him or speaks out against him. All right, so in this scandal, the people that are essentially going to uncover it are named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And this is them in their younger days when they're uncovering this scandal. This is in their Hollywood version, in this film that was made about the scandal. This is an article from 2019, I think, maybe 2020. And it is them still alive and kicking and still speaking truth to power and comparing essentially Trump to Nixon. All right, if you are bored or you love history as much as Miss Diedrich, this is for you, right? I'm not going to play you the trailer. Apparently, I played it for kids before. But I am going to encourage you to listen to it. It is great. It's called Slow Burn. There's an episode on Nixon's scandal as well as on Clinton's scandals in his office. And I really love this podcast. I think they're short. They're about 30 minutes long. But also it reminds us of all of the nuances of the little tiny stories that we tend to forget throughout history. The first episode alone is really, really crazy. It's about the Attorney General's wife. And she is known for blabbing and talking to journalists. So when the ex-Attorney General is involved in this scandal, it's going to break into something, they kidnap and drug her for the weekend so that she cannot talk. This is the Attorney General, so the highest person in the Justice Department or in the justice system in the United States that has his own wife kidnapped and drugged so that she will not talk. Oh, strange world we live in. Okay? It also talks about how even though if we go back to that map that's all red, people overwhelmingly voted for Nixon in that election. So people go from overwhelmingly liking Nixon politically or electorally to him being the only president in our entire history to resign. So what does that process look like that we go from one to the other? This is also starting the conspiracy craze that we are very familiar with, except this one is true. This crazy story about the president, or this conspiracy about the president trying to essentially get dirt on his political enemies and some other crazy things that we'll get into as we go through the scandal, turns out to be true. So, again, strange world we live in. And then also, Nixon and his co-conspirators are going to implicate themselves. So they get themselves in trouble, which I think we could talk about a lot of parallels in 2020. Okay? But it might be a good idea to think about, like, what lessons do we learn as we listen to this podcast? How does it kind of connect to where we are as a country today, particularly as we are going through the impeachment and investigations in the Trump administration? All right. But in order to understand what the heck is happening with Nixon, we need to know what obstruction of justice is. So you are obstructing justice. You're getting in the way of justice. So if we think about this in a country of laws or a justice system that says that you are innocent until proven guilty, what does that mean? So essentially, if you are trying to get in the way of an investigation or a trial, you are obstructing justice. So, for example, let's say I killed my neighbor. Sorry, neighbor. Okay. And Bob. Okay. Bob is called as a witness. Okay. He's supposed to testify. he saw me kill my neighbor, or he saw something that is going to help them prove that I killed my neighbor. I don't want to be found guilty of that. So I happen to see Bob walking on the sidewalk. And I happen to walk by Bob and I say, Bob, you and your family are so beautiful. It would be a shame if anything happened to them. I didn't directly say it, but I am tampering with that witness. I am intimidating that witness because I don't want him to testify against me. So I am obstructing justice. I'm getting in the way of the justice process. Okay? Maybe I didn't actually kill my neighbor. Okay? Maybe I know it just looks bad. There's some circumstantial evidence that does not look good for me. Okay? And I don't want to go to prison. So I'm going to intimidate Bob, even though I didn't do the original crime. So you can obstruct justice even if you are not guilty of the original thing. Okay? You can also obstruct justice even if you're not the one that is accused of anything. It's just if you're getting in the way of the justice process. All right. All right. So what the heck is the President of the United States doing? I swear, sometimes fact is far stranger than fiction. Okay. All right. So we're going to backtrack a little bit with Mr. Nixon. So even before he's going to be accused of this crime, okay, he has a list of enemies that include like people from the Beatles, right? So he has a group of people that he doesn't like, and he has a group called the Plumbers. And the Plumbers are his people that are going to essentially investigate the enemies and try and quiet them, okay, or mess with them. You kind of see that the consequences of that with a Supreme Court case. We probably mentioned the first unit called New York Times versus the United States. In that case, the Plumbers are going to break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. And if you remember, Ellsberg is the person that released the Pentagon Papers. So to try and discredit the whistleblower Ellsberg, to try and quiet the things that are happening with the Pentagon Papers, his people are going to do that. That's against the law. That's not good. Okay. But the other thing is he's going to have a group that's called CREEP. So it's the Committee to Re-elect the President, which has an unfortunate acronym of CREEP. Okay, because what they're going to do is they're going to creep into the Watergate Hotel and they're going to break into it. Okay, so when we talk about the Watergate scandal, it is the breaking into this hotel. Okay, it's called the Watergate. It's still there. You can still spend the night there. Not in the middle of a pandemic, but in normal times. Okay. And the reason that they're breaking into this hotel is this is where the Democratic National Committee has their offices. So Nixon's people are breaking into the Democratic offices to steal information and to bug it to help him with his re-election. Okay, that's not how you're supposed to win an election. Okay, so this is happening in June of '72. The election is in November. Okay, so just a couple of months away. There are two Washington Post journalists who are on the case. So Bernstein and Woodard, I already mentioned their names. Okay, so they're going to start investigating. They're going to start digging. And they're going to start to report things, okay? So, again, this is prior to the election. They're going to report things like $25,000 from the campaign went to these people involved with these burglaries, that they are pleading guilty, right, rather than testifying, right? That there's widespread spying against the DNC being reported. There's also this really fishy thing about one of the burglars' wives dying in a plane crash, and she has like tens of thousands of dollars on her. So people are like, bribe money. But even though these things are happening, right, the American people are going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. And they're still going to vote for Nixon. Okay? So even though these little pieces are starting to come out, they don't have the full story and they're still going to vote for him. Okay? The other thing, I kind of skipped over it, but I'm going to go back to it. I feel like when this was happening, Bernstein and Woodard were like, you know what? What would make this really hard for high school history teachers to teach? I know. Let's give these things some really weird names. Like, for example, let's name our source Deep Throat. Yes, they named their source. The person who is anonymously giving them information so that they can uncover this. That is the name that they give him. All right. Much later, we find out that this source, his name is Mark Felt, and he was the assistant director of the FBI. He's not actually a good guy. He's mad because he wants to be director of the FBI, and he's not getting that role. So this is his way of essentially getting back at the federal government. whatever his vendetta is, it's important that he is able to get this information to these journalists so that we ultimately know what happens. Okay? The last thing I'll mention on here, I'm not going to talk about this because it's something we didn't do, but there is a group of advisors and lawyers that resign or are fired. And this is Nixon essentially being like, don't look, I solved the problem. I let all these bad people. I cleared house. Don't look at it anymore. Everything is fine. But they're going to continue to follow. All right. So as this starts to kind of keep unraveling, there's more and more evidence that comes out. We are going to get a couple things. One, we're going to get a Senate hearing, so a hearing in Congress. We're also going to get a special prosecutor, right? So there's going to be 2 investigations that are happening at the same time. Okay? On the Senate side of things, there are going to be televised hearings, so people are watching what it is that is happening and the evidence as it comes out. So 2 of the people in the Nixon camp are going to release some pretty crazy things. Okay? One, Nixon had an enemy list, which has John Lennon on it, I mentioned a second ago. So why John Lennon is an enemy, I don't know. Okay? But there was $1 million that was put forward to essentially try and cover it up. And most importantly, that Nixon tapes every conversation in the White House, okay, in the Oval Office. That's not something he's supposed to be doing. But this is raising, or people are listening to this, are like, ooh, if there are tapes, we want those because that will prove his connection to these break-ins. Did he actually order it? Did his people do it on their own, or did he tell them to break into Watergate? The other thing, because this couldn't get any more complicated or any more controversial or any more corrupt, in the middle of this whole thing, the vice president is going to resign. So Spiro Agnew is going to resign. This is such a mess. Okay? So Gerald Ford is going to get selected as the VP, okay, in October of 1973. Okay? He gets picked by Nixon and then approved. So he's not elected. He just gets picked, which is going to become important. Okay? All right, so we have this kind of chaos, and then we have this admission about the tapes, or we find out about the tapes. So Nixon does not want to hand over the tapes. So he's trying to essentially scramble to try and find a solution that works for him. And so he says, you know what? I will let somebody listen to the tapes or confirm what it says on the transcript. I'll give you a transcript. And he says, okay, I'm a Republican. I'm going to pick a Democrat. So you guys can say it's not partisan. Everything is fine. Okay? Except that he's going to pick a 72-year-old man that has hearing problems. So that compromise is not going to work for anybody. Okay? And then as there's more and more pressure for him to release the tapes, right, he does not want that to happen. And the special prosecutor is trying to force that to happen. So he says to his attorney general, fire him. Get rid of the special prosecutor. I know he's supposed to be investigating me. I know this is supposed to make the American people feel better, blah, 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 but fire him. And the attorney general says, no, I'm not going to do that. And then the second person in charge says, no, I'm not going to do that. So it takes to the third person, okay, for Nixon to get what he wants and have the special prosecutor fired, okay? The other thing is this is all happening at the same time as the Yom Kippur War, so that crisis that I talked about in the Middle East. So this is a very chaotic time in history and for Americans. But for the American people who maybe had given Nixon the benefit of the doubt, when he's talking about firing the special prosecutor or essentially in broad daylight trying to obstruct justice or obstruct the investigation into this, it looks like he is taking, I'm going to do it for you, the Constitution and tearing it into a million pieces. So you have the President of the United States who's supposed to be all about law and order and doesn't think that the law and order or the Constitution applies to him. And so he looks very, very guilty. So there's going to be even more pressure to get those tapes and even more indictments. Ultimately, the Supreme Court will say, Nixon, you have to release the tapes. Okay? It's very similar to some Supreme Court cases that are happening right now. Okay? When Nixon releases those tapes, though, there are 18 minutes gone. Interesting. So I asked you to think about, what do you think was on those 18 minutes? Was it the smoking gun that shows that he ordered the tapes? Probably. Will we ever know? Ultimately, the House is going to take this information and they're going to vote to impeach. Okay, but then he's going to resign. Essentially, Nixon knows what's going to happen. He's going to read the writing on the walls. He knows that the Senate will convict him and kick him out of office. So rather than that, he's just going to resign. But it takes 2 years from the moment that break-in happens to him resigning. Okay? If you want to compare this to the Trump impeachment, okay? On the Trump impeachment, the House voted to impeach, and the Senate actually did a trial, essentially what you could call it, and they voted not to convict him. So he got to keep his job. Okay, Nixon didn't get that far. All right, this is a famous cartoon about Nixon and the Supreme, or not the Supreme Court, but the scandal, and it says, "I am a crook," and this part says not. So this is a connection to the 18 missing minutes. All right, just to clarify, because this is pretty confusing. We know for sure Nixon is guilty of obstruction of justice. It's unclear, we don't have definitive evidence to show that he ordered the break-in into Watergate, although he is on tape ordering other break-ins. Okay. However, we do know 100%, we know he tried to cover it up. We know he tried to pay people hush money, and he tried to use the CIA actually to get in the way of the FBI's investigation and get the burglars to plead out so that there wouldn't be a trial and that nobody could ask them questions to essentially try and keep it covered. Okay. All right. So Saturday Night Massacre, just in case it wasn't clear, because it's a confusing thing, it's a single night. Nobody dies, but he wants the special prosecutor fired. He's trying to get the tapes. So the attorney general will say no. The assistant attorney general will say no or refuse. So it takes to the third person. And this was really an attack on the justice system in the United States. It's an attack on the DOJ, Department of Justice, and people that are appointed by the Nixon administration. The moment that they aren't loyal to him or aren't protecting him, he wants to get rid of them. Okay? There are a lot of comparisons to the current administration and the way that the Nixon administration responded to things. All right. So these are some really famous political cartoons. Oh, I didn't know you could do that. We don't need my face to be any bigger, though. Okay, I point them out because Herb Block is really one of two famous political cartoonists in American history, like the two major guys. And also, he's really important because he is able to change people's minds. These cartoons are a lot of the reason why people start to change their opinion on Nixon and feel like he did something wrong. So the power of cartoons. Okay? So one, strange, they all seem to have some connection with this place. So all these scandals connected to the White House. This one, miraculous. He can walk on mud. He's supposed to walk on water. He's walking on all of his scandals. All right, so late returns. You get a block right here. Okay. But late returns, that's a connection. Returns is a connection to political returns or election returns. And so you can see by this right here that they were really excited about voting for Nixon, not so happy about this information that's coming out. Okay? And then you have Nixon, who's talking to the elephant, which is the represents the Republican Party, and he's saying to the Republican Party, erase those thoughts, resignation and impeachment. So essentially, don't think about these things. Again, a connection to those 18 minutes on the tapes. All right, our national security blanket. So he's trying to hide behind the office of the presidency or his job to be like, don't look at all of these terrible things that I'm doing. Don't look at this. One of the most powerful ones, I think, is this mugging. And he is mugging, and we know because of his cufflinks that he is mugging Lady Justice. So he is not going to let her do her job. He's instead going to take her out. All right. Listen, are you going to be loyal to me or that explicitive deleted Constitution? So here you have the President of the United States talking to the Republican Party or the GOP. And are you going to be loyal to me, the President of the United States, or the Constitution? Hopefully by now we know it is their job to be loyal to the Constitution and us, not to a single figure, since we don't live in a monarchy or tyranny. Okay? All right. This is also a really powerful one. It says, how can they say he hasn't faithfully executed the laws? And then you have a firing squad who is about to execute law and order, or Lady Justice. So not maybe what they meant by faithfully executing the law. Right. So he's running out of time, and then he's about to get swamped by the scandal. And this is the last one, so when he actually resigns. And I think this is a really important one because this is Nixon, and even though he might have seemed large in the other ones, in the grand scheme of things, he is small. Okay? And what is big is the United States. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, the Constitution won, or we as a country and our democracy won. Yes, we had this president that did this horrific thing, that violated the Constitution and hurt democracy. But at the end of the day, even though it took 2 years, et cetera, we won. Our system worked. Right. So how do we judge Nixon? Can we give him any credit for the positive things that he did? We only judge him by Watergate. I'll leave that up to you. But he is definitely, I would argue, a stain on our history because you see this constitutional crisis under him. You see this rollback from the civil rights era, and you also still see a president that would rather win in Vietnam than bring our boys back. And his stubbornness and his arrogance hurt democracy and cost people their lives. And I think it's important that we hold him accountable for those things. Oh my goodness.